Hey guys, another series compilation, the meta history of Splatoon 1 and 2. This one is a bit old. The first two episodes have the old microphone, and Splatoon 1 only had 2 episodes, so I figure I'd combine it. I hope you all enjoy.
Hello everyone. Recently I've found out that a lot of people got the game during the pandemic, around 2019 to 2020, which means a lot of the early Splatoon 1 metas were something many people didn't get to experience, and there's not a lot of footage documenting what those metas were like. So today, I'm going to be going over the early patches, from 1.0 to 1.4. This is Splatoon 2's Dark Ages, when Nintendo had no idea what they were doing, and patches were drastic and metas were incredibly strict and stupid. So, let's get started. If you enjoy this series and want to see more in the future, be sure to let me know in the comments and subscribe for more content. Without further ado, let's get into it. So, the first meta is incredibly well known. If you're around during the time Splatoon released, you knew what this was. The triple Tri-Slosher meta. Basically, back then, Tri-Slosher had increased range compared to what it does now, which means it could easily outrange a lot of the short-range shooters, which were what was pretty common at the time. It's also worth noting that on the game's launch, many weapons and many kits were completely absent, so there wasn't too much variety. Tri-Slosher had absolutely dominating matchups, with burst bombs being quite easy to use with Subsaver. This was so oppressive that you could find pretty much any Splattuber at the time making videos about it. It was pretty interesting to see meta being talked about by pretty much everyone. This patch would be dominated by Tri-Slosher and especially Triple Tri. Tri was not only a great main weapon, but armor was an amazing special, which, by the way, had a weird different sound effect at the time. Armor basically had more invincibility because removing armor had an animation, and while that animation was happening, you could not be damaged. Additionally, ink armor didn't have any piercing damage. So for example, if you got sniped by a charger, you would completely maintain your full HP and barely be knocked back. Needless to say, it was pretty broken. The main thing to counter this would end up being the Rapid Blaster, as Rapid is the best weapon in the game at dealing with armor at this time, as well as mines and Bomb Rush being great at removing it. Rapid was pretty much the same thing, but with a slightly larger radius and a 180p Bomb Rush. At this time, there were a few other things in the meta. Inkjet had a humongous hitbox, though the shots did travel slower, making it incredibly easy to use and very powerful. Because of this, we saw a good bit of Tenatech and the N-Parry dualies, which, in this case, N-Parry was used more for Inkjet spam as it had a much lower points for special. We also saw a little bit of Junior, though it became pretty outclassed by Tri, and a bit of Firefin, though it became pretty outclassed by Rapid. Overall, this meta wasn't great. There was a lot of fighting happening due to how powerful Tri-Slosher was, but the main weapon was so incredibly broken and Armor Inkjet were so incredibly better than every other special in the game that it was overall just way too drastic. This brings us to Splatoon's very first patch, something that dropped only a few days after the game released, version 1.1.2. Now, I should mention that this patch did not affect the meta. Pretty much everything I said applies to this patch as well. The only main changes are that the N-Parry dualies get lower points for special and Tenatech gets higher points for special, which means T-Tech is a bit worse at Inkjet spamming and is a bit more used for the main weapon, while dualies, which have very slow rolls at the time and less range than splatter shots, ended up being more for Inkjet spam. Tri was also given an additional 30 points for special, which didn't matter whatsoever. Patch 1.2 came out shortly after, which had some nice buffs, mostly quality of life related, and the main one being that chargers got a little bit better since they got their old charge times brought back, since Splatoon 2 increased it for Splat Charger and E-Liter by 4 frames, and it also gave Baller a pretty substantial damage buff. However, outside of these, and the dualies being given their extra range for higher points for specials, not too much changed. It was a lot of important changes, but again, nothing that would shift the meta. However, skipping up to patch 1.3.0, which dropped on September 7, 2017, Nintendo would finally kill Tri-Slosher to end the meta, not completely ruining it from usage, but they went a bit overboard with the damage nerf. Tri would eventually, over the course of many patches, be brought back to a really good state, but as of right now, this is the worst Tri-Slosher ever was. However, despite this good news, patch 1.3 was potentially the worst balance patch ever, and it already starts with Ray. This is where Stingray got its laser beam on the outside. This patch added it, as well as giving it longer duration. This patch also attempted to fix Splashdown, which gave it many notable buffs. Inkstorm would also get a super crazy buff, increasing the radius by a large degree, making it very extreme. This would also come with reducing the points for special on many Inkstorm weapons, which ended up making things way too drastic. Inkjet would finally get its reductions, and so would armor, giving damage piercing, reducing the invulnerability, and for Inkjet reducing the size and increasing the hurt box. However, the main change would be Baller. It already got some great HP changes, but now it got the damage and radius changes, which made it insanely powerful, and thus 1.3 would be defined by Baller. So, while the triple try meta might have died down, it ended up getting replaced with a far worse meta. As you can see from the weapons in this comp, taken from Pangit, which shows a match between SCDX, one of the best teams at the time, against a top JP team, there were a total of 4 Stingrays and 3 Ballers. This was the new meta, Ballers and Rays. Stingray would primarily be used on both regular Charger and the vanilla Machine, as there weren't too many good Ray options at the time and Machine was pretty extreme. As for Ballers, the main usage of those would be coming from Aerospray, the RG1 specifically having incredibly good painting capability, and a little bit of L3, though 52 and Luna Blaster did also see some use. This meta was pretty much entirely defined by the extremity of those specials. Stingray kills so unbelievably fast that it's a humongous threat. Running 2 or 3 of them in a comp isn't even that major a downside, even in zones. As for Baller, it's pretty much unstoppable and the explosion is very lethal, which means it controls space unbelievably easily just by existing. During this time, we still saw some experimentation. Splatter shots would start to go to the vanilla splatter shot. Due to some issues with the netcode and how it handled splashdown, canceling it was kind of dependent on connections, so in some cases, splashdown just wouldn't die and be invincible. This would be something that would be patched a long time later, but it's worth noting for the next meta. Additionally, burst bombs were really strong, as Sub-Saver could stack with them very easily, meaning just running 1 main and 3 subs of Sub-Saver would allow you to have triple burst bombs. This meta overall is pretty much no one's favorite, and Nintendo seek to replace it pretty quickly, to varying levels of success. On October 10th, 2017, patch 1.4 would release. This would be a patch note that would focus on main weapons, and oh boy, did it focus on main weapons. It gave a lot of important buffs, but to go over some of the main ones, Zap got made quite a little bit faster. H3 Nozzle Nose got its shot velocity and a few other quality of life changes. Clash Blaster got its extra radius size. Dynamo and a lot of the other rollers got some major quality of life changes. Same for the brushes and chargers and E-leaders in terms of painting, damage, and more. Most of these as a result of Baller nerfs. Splatlings with some more mobility speeds, dualies with less end lag after dodge rolls, but the main one would be the Brellas. Both Tenebrella and regular Brella would get some amazing, insane buffs, and while a lot of them were needed, the ones for the Brellas went really overboard, which would lead to a very interesting meta. Also, while this bug was patched about a week after the patch dropped, they accidentally made Brellas able to shoot and shield at the exact same time. Also, if you're curious, yes, this also worked with Tenebrella, and I honestly think this might have inspired Nintendo to make Undercover Brella, but of course that's just speculation. It's also worth noting in terms of nerfs that Stingray was barely toned down, while Machine got a sizable painting nerf as well as Aerospray, so they mostly focused on reducing special output. Bubble Blower was introduced, but the special was so new and early that people didn't really focus on it too much. But don't worry, it'll definitely make a return in the next patch. The main thing to be nerfed was Baller, which would finally bring an end to the major Baller meta for quite some time. And so, with the extreme Brella nerfs giving it its speed, mobility, and most importantly its shield HP back, one that has not been toned down over time yet, like it has in the future. Brella right now has a ton of damage multipliers to allow weapons like blasters, buckets, and chargers to counter it. Back then, that simply didn't exist, so making Brella a brawler made it an insanely heavy meta weapon. In Japan, there would be 2 to 3 Brellas in comms, and in the Western scene, nobody would use it. Because it was a new weapon class, as well as another weapon becoming very strong that was common, the Brella meta that existed in Japan didn't exist much in the Western scene. But it's worth noting that even though there's not too much footage of it, Brellas were extremely common in Japan, with 2 to 3 of them being ran in many team comms. The Western scene had a bit of a different approach. There was a good bit of variety and experimentation with all of the main weapons that got buffed, but the main things that were present were a lot more bomb defense, plenty of Stingrays, mainly with the V machines and chargers like in the previous patch, and burst bombs. people would take full advantage of the improved splashdown, as well as the bug that prevented it from being shot down, as well as Tri-Slosher with Sub-Saber to have a ton of heavy burst bombs that you could use. By using your burst bombs and then pressing armor or splashdown, you basically got a mini burst bomb rush that did incredibly high damage, and because splashdown couldn't be killed and armor was still very strong, it gave people a lot of survivability and poking power. So, with Brella being inconsistent in terms of latency, as well as being really uncommon since it's a new weapon class and not many people decided to pick it up, ultimately led to the Western scene being much more of a burst bomb V-shot Tri-Slosher meta. It is worth noting though, as time went on, more and more Stingrays would be common, especially on certain maps. Port Mackerel is probably the main example, where you can see here, even on zones, there are 5 Stingrays in this comp, with the other weapons being primarily used to paint for specials. Ultimately, the Splatoon patches of the early days were not great, and there was a ton of extreme things in the meta. However, because the game was so new, people didn't really have anything super optimized, and people were very willing to experiment, so it wasn't all the time that you would have to deal with this extreme meta. It was overall still a pretty interesting time, but it's good to see that Nintendo would get better at patches in the future, as this is the last of the super extreme ones that they did. But I hope you found this look back to the past interesting, and I hope you're looking forward to part 2, where we tackle a bunch of different fighting metas in the 2.0s. This is Chara, and welcome to part 2 of the Splatoon 2 meta history. Today we're going to be talking about patch 2.0 through 2.3. If you haven't seen part 1, I'd highly recommend it, as some of the changes that happened in those patches are going to be very influential for what happens here. And also I want to say that there is a bit of limited footage for patches at this time, so I kind of had to look around quite a while, and there isn't as much footage of the double weapon combinations I'll be talking about today. With that all being said, let's get started. Patch 2.0.0 was released on November 23rd, 2017. This patch would buff Tri-Slosher back to being 190p, but more importantly, the job of this patch is to nerf burst bombs. And the way they would do this is by making it so to get triple burst bomb, you would need to run 2 pures of Sub-Saver instead of the normal 1 pure, making it so that triple burst bomb would be much less common. This would also come with some changes all around, but the other notable one would be Tenebrella, which would basically be given buffs to allow its shield launch to be faster and regenerate faster. This is basically where Tenebrella became more known for launching its shield instead of holding it out like regular Brella does. The first weapon becoming more common right now is N-Zap. This is basically where N-Zap became the primary support weapon for right now, as having double Zap was pretty strong, and Zap was around 190p rather than the 200 it is now, which means it was really fast at getting armor, especially for the time. But the main reason you would see Zaps is to counter Forge. Now, why Forge? Forge was the first weapon to be able to do the infamous Bubble Blower combo, which was released a good bit before 2.0, but really started to take form now. Bubbles at this time were huge, and that just made the bubble combo even more deadly than it is now. And they also lasted a good bit longer than they do today. And while people weren't too good at it, as you can see by this footage, even with a little bit of special power-up, the bubbles are absolutely massive compared to how they are now, so having Ink Armor is one of the only counterplays to avoid dying to it at the time. We also got to see some more Stingrays, normally in the form of V-Machines, which at the time ran Special Saver because people weren't aware of Quick Super Jump, but also a little bit of Heavies and Chargers. Patch 2.1 would then follow very shortly after on December 12th, and this would mainly be a patch to adjust stages, which is where a lot of the stages lost their old field type and started to become a lot better designed. However, the big takeaway from this patch would be that Brellas would be nerfed a significant degree against Blasters and Chargers, cementing those classes as counters to it, and the normal Blaster would be 7 frames faster going into Squid form after shooting, which would basically kickstart the next meta. The other reason we saw more Zaps was Blaster. As you can tell, 7 frames is a pretty significant buff in terms of ending lag, so we started to see a lot more of the regular and custom Blaster. Both of them were used since Splashdown wasn't cancelable at this time due to the latency bug it still had, and Blaster with its reduced ending lag frame thing was overall pretty good. And since Zap was the only meta weapon right now that painted a ton, since there was a good bit of Forge and Blaster and Charger, it overall didn't have too heavy of a paint meta for Blasters to be pushed out of the way. And this means we actually got to see a little bit of Double Zap and Double Blaster. So, Blaster players, I hope you enjoyed 2.1, because this is the best normal Blasters ever got. It's all downhill from here. Patch 2.2 would drop on January 16th, 2018, and this would have a few changes, mainly buffing some of the rollers, but the main thing would be the sloshers, which very similar to the Blasters, got a buff in terms of being able to swim out of a slosh, this time by 4 frames instead of 7 per blaster. Also notable is Heavy Spiraling getting its increased damage from 28 to 32. There were also some notable sub and special weapon changes. Splat Bomb and Suction Bomb had its outside radius reduced, so yes, the hitbox that's still ridiculous nowadays used to be even worse. And they toned down Bubble Blower by allowing opponents' attacks to do a little bit more damage to it, which ended up helping a lot at the time. Finally, in the points for specials, Zap would get its 210p and Forge would get its 200, therefore ending the Forge and Zap being big staples in the meta. As you can guess, this patch was filled with a good bit of double bucket. Slosher Deco was great since it was 190p and Baller was very good for comboing out of it. We saw a lot less of Zaps and Forge, but everything else was about the same. Blasters remained pretty common and didn't really fall off much due to their lack of nerfs, and we still saw a good bit more V-shots, especially with the nerfs to Zap. Outside of that, there was a lot of experimentation. There isn't too much to say. Double Bucket was pretty impressive and pretty aggressive, but it was nothing too broken. This is the first patch where nothing really felt super extreme, since Bubble Blower got toned down. 2.3.0 would really just be home to some great buffs. H3 finally got its lack of jump RNG and a little bit more turfing, which finally allowed it to be used in the meta. On top of that, Tenna missiles were finally able to swim around. Yes, before this time, if you popped missile, you couldn't go into squid form and swimming around. This was a huge buff for the special. Points for special wise, Bucket Deco would get turned to 200p and they would finally take Tenatech off 230p. Overall, a pretty good patch. Nothing that really fixed anything super much in terms of broken weapons, but a lot of buffs to help other weapons. Kinda miss it, to be honest. Unfortunately, not everything is meant to last, and we saw a lot of Heavy Spiraling. Back then, Heavy still painted about the same, but it was 180p for Ray, and Sprinkler painted super well, which means it was really great for spamming Ray. We even saw a good bit of double Heavy at this time. Now, some of you may know there's something I've neglected to mention about Ray up until this point. Not only did it have its insane damage and duration, but back then, you could just, use it inside your spawn shield and be completely invincible. This is the main thing that made Ray so broken. There was literally no counterplay. It lasted forever, killed super fast, and people finally learned you can just jump to spawn and use it inside your spawn shield. This was probably the worst meta Splatoon 2's ever had. It was incredibly passive, but the main problem is on Tower and Rainmaker. If you didn't have the lead and the opponents had Ray, you just kinda lost the game. It was absolutely hell. And to wrap things up, we have 3.0, which would fix quite a lot of things. 3.0 would start with a huge change, one that was actually hidden in the bug fixes, which is making it so Splashdown wasn't really dependent on internet connection to take damage. Which basically meant, from this point forward, Splashdown is terrible and would get shot out of the sky. So goodbye Splashdown, it was a good run. On top of that, this is another patch where we got a great deal of buffs spread out across main weapons, something the game absolutely needed at the time. This is also where Sprinkler would start to get its rework, where it basically became unable to paint but started to be a bit more durable. Yeah, this didn't really work out for the sub in the long run. And Stingray would finally get its first major nerf, reducing the damage per frame from 2.0 to 1.8, and making it so you can't use it inside your spawn barrier. This is far from the last change Stingray will need to get, as you can see on screen right now, but it is the start of Nintendo finally acknowledging this special is a problem. Finally, we got a good amount of gear changes and buffs, which would help gear diversity quite a bit, and this will end off by having Heavy Spiraling be 200, and Bucket Deco being 220, and regular Blaster being 190. And that is it for patches 2.0s. A lot of this was really damage control for 1.0, and while Nintendo overbuffed a little bit, it was far less significant than it was in the early versions. 3.0s would be a time where the meta was much more stable, and Splatoon would finally get its reputation as a balanced game. To learn more about that and the rock, paper, scissors meta, you'll have to take a look at next week's episode for patch 3.0.
In the past 2 episodes of the meta history, I talked a lot about the game being in a very unbalanced state. In the 1.0s, we had stuff like Triple Tri-Slosher, Old Brella, and Stingray. And in the 2.0s, we had stuff like Pre-Patch Bubble Blower, Double of Plenty of Weapons, and, Stingray again. They really took their time fixing that special, didn't they? But today, we're going to be talking about the 3.0s. This is Splatoon's golden age, with almost nothing being broken, a relatively good balance with a wide variety of weapons and weapon classes in the meta, and a really fun time. Let's go over what exactly makes this so great. If you enjoyed this episode of the Meta History, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the future parts. And with that all being said, let's get started. First up is patch 3.0, which will have a lot of important buffs, such as making Squeezer's paint mode actually paint, helping with a bunch of fixes for dynamos and brushes, increasing Brella paint, making weapons paint their feet better overall, giving Bamboo 85 damage, increasing the range for Gluga Dualies, and making Tenebrella paint better and its shield regen faster, which will be a huge thing for making it meta. On top of that, we got some sub-weapon adjustments, making Beacon significantly better, Ink Mine being able to sub-strafe, which is a huge buff for that sub-weapon, Hurling Bomb being reworked, Sprinkler being able to take much more damage, and even Stingray got some damage reduction and prevented you from using it inside your spawn shield. We even got to see some solid gear buffs. This patch just had it all. Real quick, we can also talk about 3.1.0 purely because it didn't have that big an impact on the meta. It had some nice buffs for Tetra Dualies and Undercover Brella, and reduced Blaster's explosion radius, which is a pretty fair nerf. This wouldn't kick Blaster out of the meta, as it would still really benefit from what the 3.0 meta was, and overall made things a lot more fair. We also got to see end parries become 190, to reduce a bit of the inkjet spam happening, but we'll get to that a bit later. That was really it for 3.1. It was a very short patch. And finally, we're going to be talking about the 3.2.0 patch notes right at the start as well, and this is because it was an overall great patch. Some of the buffs here were really great at giving some weapons their own sense of identity. This is where Junior got its larger ink tank, and Splash-O-Matic got its lack of jump RNG. Luna Blaster got a similar buff to have a lack of RNG, and L3's got their increased necessary movement speed. H3 got that cool sound effect for when you hit a 3-shot and was able to finally ink a wall properly. Rollers were no longer ink hungry when rolling at full speed. Squiffer got to charge full speed in the air. Hydra Splatling got its damage back, and finally Undercover got its shield regen for an assist. And they also increased the damage to the Rainmaker shield from E-Leaders by 15%, but nobody cares about that part. So many of these buffs gave weapons a sense of identity and made them super unique compared to others in their class, which was overall really impactful. This patch is arguably the best in Splatoon 2's history off of that alone. The nerfs were also pretty fair. Rapid Blaster got the same nerf as the regular Blaster, making its shot size a little bit smaller. Ballpoint charged really fast when out of ink or in the air, so they toned that down. And Dually Squelchers had a massive paint output because of their standard fire mode, so they reduced that by 20%. All good changes. If that wasn't good enough, Autobomb used 55% of the ink tank instead of 70, meaning it was actually a usable sub-weapon, and this is the patch that actually fixed 10 missiles, allowing you to use them to mark onto a single target with 10, or 2 targets with 5, and overall changing quite a bit to help the special be better. Additionally, they did nerf Inkjet slightly, but more by making it fair, giving you an actual gauge when the Inkjet marker lands. Before this, an Inkjet user landing would have no indication of when exactly it was going to touch the ground. Points for special buffs would be a bit standard, but would pretty much reduce special output altogether, especially on the custom Dually Squelchers, end parry Dualies, regular Dualies, Ballpoint, Mini, regular Slosher, Rapid Blaster, and I guess they did it for the Clash Blaster and Custom Blaster. Wasn't really needed, but doesn't really hurt it super much either. Overall, an amazing patch, making the current meta even better in this version than in previous. Still with me? Alright, so now let's talk about what exactly is good in this meta. Now, the top 3 weapons currently are the End Parry Splat Dualies, Splat Brella, and Custom Blaster. And these weapons effectively form a triangle with each other. Basically, Blaster counters Brella, Brella counters Dualies, and Dualies counter Blaster. This is a really great thing to have for your top tiers, because it means everything in the meta is going to have an effective counter. The best weapons aren't something that no one else can fight. 52. It's something that you want to run the meta to counter the meta. And it also leaves plenty of room in weapon comps to run things that aren't as conventional. There's a lot of other things that are great in this meta right now, so I'm going to talk about a bunch of the other options that saw plenty of use these days. The regular Roller and Carbon were in pretty good spots since they could fight stuff in the meta and didn't have to deal with armor as much, where Dynamo was also pretty solid for its special output for whichever one you needed, being armor or Stingray, and the Flail Flingser Roller would start to see some use once missiles got buffed in patch 3.2. Nozzle Noses also finally got to see some use. L3 was great for outputting Inkjets and Ballers and had solid fighting capabilities, where H3D was great for armor support. Definitely a bit challenging, but since it was 190p, you could output a lot more than you could today. And finally, there was Flail Squeezer, which now that it's had its painting mode buffed, was about the same as the weapon it is today. So while it took a lot of time for people to master it, it would still be a really strong pick for those choosing to invest into it. Bucket fans had a good bit of everything. Try was useful on its short-range maps, Machine Neo was still pretty solid if you mained the weapon, Bucket had both the regular kit and Deco seeing use, since Bucket Deco actually had a special at this time because Baller was not utter trash. Explo and Blob were both new, with Bloblobber having a lot better damage at the time, giving it some great uses in Rainmaker or against stuff like Brellas or Baller users. Now on top of that, we even got to see some X-Splosher. X-Splosher at the time had broken Inconficiency in Paint, but people were a bit new and getting used to it. It was amazing in zones and could even work in the other modes with how great the main weapon was. So there was plenty of things if you liked buckets. As for Splatlings, we got to see a lot of the ballpoint. While it didn't have its Nouveau kit, it was still a really strong main weapon, so even something like Toxic Mist and Inkjet on a backline ended up working out pretty well for it. It was a pretty unique weapon, and its ability to be a jack of all trades by having a close-range fighting mode was something we never really saw from the Splatling class. It was a great option, and as time would go on, we would enter a ballpoint meta much later in the 4.0s, but that's getting a bit ahead of ourselves. What about Chargers? Now, Chargers were in a fine spot in terms of they could counter most of the current trio of weapons, because they were slower ones with Dualies and lag, Blasters lag, and Brella being able to have its shield broken. But the main thing Charger struggled with were the obscene amount of Inkjets in the meta. Now, Charger of course could deal with Inkjet by shooting it out of the sky, but there were just so many Inkjet dives and they were so frequent with the amount of double or even sometimes triple jet comps. That being said, it's still Charger versus Inkjet. It's not really that bad, especially without as much armors. And we did get to see a good bit of the Reg Charger and Firefin with their better paint. The normal E-Leader was still pretty solid in zones. Squiffer with its new charging fast in the air capability was solid, and even Bamboo would see some use from some really dedicated players, showing it didn't need main power to see some form of success. YouTuber was the only one we didn't really see whatsoever. Admittedly, shooters right now kind of struggled. Shooters are a lot faster nowadays because in the 4.0s they would start to get some end and starting lag buffs. However, the main shooters we did see would be Neosplash after its jump RNG buff, a little bit of T-Tech, but honestly N-Parry kind of hard outclassed it, and mainly Custom Jet Squelcher because Ray was broken. Yay! Oh, and of course a little bit of Junior and NZAP for the armor support category, but again, nothing staple. H3D eventually became the superior option for the armor support options if you did want to run armor at the time. Finally, there was a bit of Inkbrush Nouveau, so pretty much every class had some viable option at this time, which as you can see is pretty amazing. This meta was really diverse and was a big first for Splatoon's history. Splatoon 1 had nowhere near this level of weapon diversity, and early Splatoon 2 was way too unbalanced to have this. Comps that we have nowadays don't hold a candle to the amount of variety in weapon classes that were used these days. And while the meta may be more aggressive than it is passive, I think people overall had a lot more fun with it. This to me is when Splatoon was at its peak. The balance patches were great, there wasn't too much over nerfing or main power or power creep, and it wasn't in the same early chaotic broken state that it was at the start. A lot of the things that needed to be toned down had been toned down. And while I wish Ray was toned down like it was in 4.0 earlier in the 3.2 era, I think it's ultimately not a huge damper on the meta. And this brings us to 4.0.0, released September 13th, 2018. Now this patch wouldn't end the 3.0's meta, it would continue for a little bit, but this patch did start the trend of continuing to nerf things even though the state of the game was pretty well balanced. The only extreme thing right now is Ray, and despite that, we would continue to get nerfs in future that were just way too overboard. Now this patch really only had the dualies in this case, with the ink consumption being increased from 6 to 9%. The changes to Blob and Slosher were plenty fair, but it was the start of nerfs that would really start to become more extreme and more undeserving as time went on, rather than buffing other weapons to increase their strength. In this patch alone, we only saw 52, 96, Luna, a little bit of Ink Mine, and Rapid Blaster getting 10 less points for special. That's it. Everything else points for special-wise was a nerf. The specials were only nerfed. And while the stage reworks were nice, overall things were going to get a good bit weaker in terms of main weapons, unless if you played a shooter. Now, I admittedly look on this era with a bit of nostalgia. I mean, this is when Prophecy started, the team I would be on for almost 3 years, and I have a ton of memories from this time. But looking back, I really forgot just how diverse comps were. This is one of the main strengths Splatoon has. You can fight a comp that has a bucket and umbrella and a blaster, in addition to something like a bathtub, all in one comp. What other game can you see stuff like this? And seeing the current Splatoon meta be reduced to more just shooters and shooters and shooters just really sucks. I really hope Splatoon 3 looks more like this in terms of its variety. Now, 4.0s are going to introduce a lot of problems. There will be some positive changes, but there's going to be some power creep and a lot of things to deal with. but that'll have to be for another video. This, to me, will forever be the golden age of Splatoon 2, and I will always look on it very fondly. Alright, well we just finished covering the golden age. There's 3.0 through 3.2 done. Next up is the 4.0, should be pretty simple. How many of those are there again? Oh no. Ah yes, the 4.0s, back when Nintendo gave us a balance patch like every single month. And this is also the time where we got all the Kensa collection, all the Sheldon's picks, Booyah Bomb, Ultra Stamp, Torpedo, and Fizzy Bomb. There's a lot to cover, so let's get started. Since we covered 4.0 in the previous part, we're gonna jump straight to 4.1, released on October 2nd, 2018. This patch had a lot of minor buffs, but some interesting major ones. The 96 got flat out extra range, which was pretty significant for them. Undercover got more reliable damage to hit 40 more easily. Splash Wall had ink recovering faster. 10 missiles got fired faster. But most importantly, Nautilus got its shot speed increased by 133%. This is basically when Nautilus became good, but without the gold Nautilus kit or many people giving it attention, it wouldn't even pop up into the meta until much later. On points for special, the main things to note is that both the Splat Charger, Firefin, and End Parries continued to get nerfs in the points for special department. This would kind of hurt End Parry's inkjet output, but Firefin and Charger have not received their paint nerf yet, so they were still insanely good at outputting Ray and Bomb Rush. This update would also introduce new content in the form of the absolutely broken Fizzy Bomb, the absolutely underpowered Booyah Bomb, and the K-Pro and K-Machine. K-Pro would be significant later when they added MPU, but K-Machine would be the main weapon to take advantage of Fizzy Bomb. Staple weapons like the Dualies and Chargers would get a little bit weaker, but it wouldn't really change too much, and people were also a bit new at experimenting with how exactly you could abuse Fizzy Bomb, so the meta didn't really change too much between 4.1 and 4.0. 4.2 was released shortly after on November 6, 2018, and it also wouldn't change too much. It did, however, plant the seeds for shooter buffs that would really start to take effect later into the game's life cycle. This one decreasing the end lag for all shooters and Squeezer. Pretty drastic. Ink Brush would get a bit of extra painting range, which would be important later, and Tri-Slosher would become light class from medium, giving it effectively 2 extra subs of swim and run speed on it at all times. Beacon would get the ability to have 2 people jump to one of them, something that would become very important in a patch later. And points for special wise would again be minor changes. Tenebrella and H3D getting some slaps on the wrist, as well as Charger getting another points for special increase to help deal with the Ray output. This patch introduced Ultra Stamp, which like Booyah was way too weak at launch to be notable, but it would also introduce Torpedo, which was really strong at the time, as well as Kensa Jr. and Kunder, which, while it would take a little bit of time for people to get used to, by next patch both of them would be devastating. Alright, so with the lackluster patches out of the way, 4.3 comes in on December 4th, 2018, and oh boy, this is probably the most drastic patch Splatoon has had since the 1.0s. Before we get into the additions, Mini, Heavy, and Hydra got better buffs from the run speed effect, which is a good change that they needed. They finally fixed Splat Charger and Firefin, lowering their paint output, though they didn't adjust their points for special back for some reason. Tent and Sorella 10 had their durability of the shield lessened, though they made the shield launch do a bit more damage to compensate, which was another great change. Fizzy Bomb got toned down as people started to realize that Double Fizzy was absolutely broken at stalling the zone, in this case Sub-Saver being decreased in its effectiveness and the ink recovery taking longer to start. Which, while it was helpful, did not tone down Fizzy nearly enough, and it would still be used to stall objectives or control space. Splashdown got better damage to objects, mainly the Brella Shield and Ballers. Baller also got increased damage to Brella Shields. They made Ultra Stamp a bit more of a functioning special by allowing the swings to happen much faster. While it still struggles to block shots, this would make it an actual usable special. And they also made it easier to turn or rotate. Ray finally got some significant tone backs, again something that's been lacking for a bit, though it was not major enough. It mostly just made specials like Ink Armor or Baller more prevalent against it. It would not be the last time this special got nerfed. And then randomly, they decreased Inkjet's damage to Baller. I don't know why, but they did. Swim speed got adjusted on heavy weapons, so it stacks better at lower quantities, which is awesome. And they buffed ink resistance to help avoid taking damage by stepping into enemy ink, making 0.1 or 0.2 ink res really common. Though they did this because they introduced something we'll get to in a tiny bit. Finally, on the points for special, some minor nerfs to the Splatbrella and Kensa Jr., K Jr. mainly for its torpedo bubble potential, and Brella because it's very prevalent. This patch also introduced the most amount of strong new weapon kits, including the custom Explosher, being really useful over the normal one because Baller could be used to live Ray, Ballpoint Nuvo having Beacon and Rain, Blah Blah Deco, Nautilus 79, Kensa 52, and Kensa Rapid Blaster. But most importantly, this patch introduced Main Power-Up. Main Power-Up is so drastic because it gives a crazy buff to every single weapon class, which would be okay if the main power-up effects were all reasonable, but unfortunately just one of them wasn't. Damage Up. Kensa Pro with MPU, Dualies with MPU, Dualie Squelchers, Ballpoint, Bamboo, Hydra. There were so many weapons that got drastically overbuffed in the most stupid way just by the addition of this one ability. And at the time, it didn't require as strong main power quantities as it would in future. I truly believe this patch is where things really started to go downhill. Sure, some things were a bit unreasonable, like how they handled nerfing Charger and Dualies, but nothing was really game-breaking. This patch would introduce so many problems that I believe patches from here really struggled to keep up with how exactly to fix them. The best weapon of this patch would be Ballpoint. Like, it's not even close. Even on Ballpoint's release, there were pro players calling out how insanely good it would be, but now with the addition of main power-up alongside Ballpoint's old damage means both the short and long range modes could 3-shot you, on top of not having all the nerfs that are going to come to it over the next few patches. Ballpoint, even to this day, is known as a jack-of-all-trades backline, but back then it was the master of all trades. Even after Ballpoint's damage would eventually get reduced, you would still see 2 of them in team comps. Armor support started to become more and more of an essential role at this time, with the H3 and Kensa Undercover being the main picks. H3 just got buffed with a brand new main power-up effect, giving it an ability to 2-shot, while Kensa Undercover Brella had extremely broken torpedoes that would do a ton of damage and was only 1 ADP for ink armor. As Charger's points for special rose, as well as a lowered painting capability, we saw more custom jet squelchers in the backline for that ray output, especially with how absurd Stingray was at this time. In the aggressive weapon category, we saw a good bit of Kensa machines. Even with the nerf to fizzy bombs, it was still incredibly strong, especially at dealing with some of these MPU damage up weapons. And we even got to see the resurgence of Dualies with the Kensa Dualie kit, especially since you only needed a very low amount of main power to become a 3-shot. You might be expecting version 4.4 to be next, but nope, 2 weeks later version 4.3 released, being a patch to almost exclusively focus on main power-up fixes. Oh boy. A lot of weapons would get slight improvements to their main power-up effects, some being really notable, like the E-Leader getting a little bit more range, or Mini Spotling getting a bit longer of a charge that it can get, Undercover being able to have a better curve, so the shield comes back a little bit faster, but mainly, this is here to fix MPU damage up. We would now be preventing Hydra from being able to get 33.3 damage without a full charge. Ballpoint would require more MPU to get 33.3, though you would still be able to do it, and they even nerfed the run speed effect on it because Ballpoint was that bad. Dualies would now require more gear to get 33.3. Both Fizzy Bomb and Torpedo would be nerfed, Torpedo fixing the insane damage it had and making it cost more ink, and Fizzy Bomb decreasing the paint output it provided. Finally, in this patch, they also nerfed Bubble Blower because it used to be a little bit too big, so the bubble combo that it's still infamous for today used to be even stronger, and they would make Ballpoint, Blob, and for some reason Hydra an additional 10 points for special. Welcome to patch 4.4.0, aka Damage Control. Remember those shooter and lag buffs we just gave 2 patches ago? Well, now we're gonna pair it with a bunch of startup lag ones too. Hopefully this doesn't end up being something more drastic one day. Squiffer and E-Leader would both get added main power-up effects, allowing them to turf better, which would be really important for both of these weapons. For Ballpoint Splatling, Nintendo straight up removed its ability to 3-shot with MPU. It was that bad, making its short-range mode do 28 damage and its long-range mode do 30 damage. It would not stop the Ballpoint meta though. Both Splat Dualies and Tetra Dualies would get a slightly smaller hitbox, which is something that they adjusted in an earlier patch, making it easier to hit people with Dualies. So it's just really a revert, but it's another really odd one. Specials is where this patch would really be drastic. Outside of the small missile buff making them a little bit faster, Booyah Bomb and Ultra Stamp would become actual functioning special weapons, Booyah Bomb being a little bit overbuffed and Ultra Stamp not really being too overbuffed, finally settling into a place of being somewhat useful. Additionally, ink resistance would be buffed as a way to help counter MPU damage up, allowing a little bit of ink res to give you more immunity before you started taking damage, which would be a little bit helpful. Most of the top picks at this patch would receive slight nerfs, which wouldn't really change things. Machine would still be really popular, H3 would still be really popular, Expo would still be really good in zones, but Ballpoint was the second weapon in Splatoon 2's history to get to 230 points for special, with Tenatech being the only other exception. And like with T-Tech, this would end up being a mistake that would be toned down later. 4.4 would be a tamer version of 4.3 for the most part, but there would be two new faces. Bamboo would be seeing a bit more use for its ability to shred objects and people slowly realizing you could one-shot. But more importantly, now that Booyah Bomb was an actual special, Kensa Splattershot Pro became the ultimate dually counter, completely pushing Kensa dualies out of the meta slowly, having a high Booyah output at only 180p, and not relying on that much gear at this time. Patch 4.5 would come up next and be another strange one. Once again, we're getting more shooter buffs. Spray shooters would get the ability to recover ink faster, even though all of them are already very ink efficient. 52 and 96 would get increased damage to objects, which makes somewhat sense. Luna Blaster getting the same damage to object increase. Rapid main power would now allow its radius to be slightly larger, which would be pretty important for it later on. All rollers, except Dynamo, would get increased damage to Brella shields as well. Tri-Slasher would get a bit more range on the center shot, but the main buff of this patch would be Mini Spotlight. You could now jump a bit higher when you fully charge the Spotlight, giving it some new options, and it was able to run a bit faster both while charging and firing. There were also some pretty substantial nerfs. H3 required more gear in order to use main power-up effectively. Bamboo's ultimately ridiculous damage to objects would be toned down, though this would still be a crazy strength of the weapon as long as you are running that main power-up. Machine would consume more ink and have a slightly smaller radius, which is good because it was a really extreme hitbox at the time. And Explosion would finally get its big zones nerf, reducing the splash damage radius, but more importantly, reducing the ink efficiency by 30%. You used to have around 12 sloshes on this weapon, and now it's around 8, which is much more fair. Fizzy Bomb would get nerfed again, decreasing the damage radius this time for the second and third explosion. Inkstorm would get its effect radius decreased, meaning it was a little bit smaller, but it would paint a tiny bit better in that area. Another little indirect nerf to Ballpoint. They buffed Bomb Defense DX's effects against Point Sensor. I don't know why they did this. Poor Point Sensor, bro. I feel bad. On the nerf side of things, Kensa Splattershot Pro would get its first tone down, being an additional 20 points for Booyah. H3 would get to 20, even though it was starting to fall off, and both Custom Explosher, which was fair, and Custom Hydra, again for some reason, would get an additional 10 points for special. The main thing to change from this patch was the armor support. There would still be a lot of Kunder, but H3 would slowly start to fall off and be replaced by NZAP. But because NZAP was still 210p and Last Stitch wasn't super buffed yet, it wasn't really that strong an option as it is today. Despite the points for special nerfs, Splattershot Pro would still be really common and if anything would remain a staple for a bit longer. However, Mini would be the main winner of this patch. Missiles aren't the insane thing they are today, but they're still pretty good, and with only 190p, Mini would be able to output them easily, so this increased mobility and ability to jump gave it a lot more options in fights. Throughout the 4.0s, while Brella and Tenebrella had gotten slight indirect nerfs, mainly making other weapons stronger against it, both would still be pretty good picks. The regular Brella would struggle a bit with the Ballpoint, as the amount of walling out potential it put meant it was a bit difficult to shield it head on. We're only halfway through the 4.0s, and already the meta has gone into a very different and more strict spot than it was during the 3.0s. Some new things that they added were nice, a lot of the main weapon buffs to things like Mini Spotlight were cool, and even Ballpoint was pretty fun as an extremely good weapon, but as a whole, a lot of the game's balance was kind of thrown out the window to add new things, and a lot of stuff didn't feel like it had proper testing, especially main power damage up. Welcome back to the Splatoon meta history. This time we'll be covering the second half of the 4.0s, patch 4.6 through 4.9. Does this fix the problems of the previous ones? Sort of. There were definitely some interesting choices being made, so be sure to subscribe if you want to see more, and let's get right into it with patch 4.6. This update was released on April 2nd, 2019, and featured a lot of random changes. It starts out with a really cool one though. Sploosh basically gets faster acceleration, meaning it's quicker to reach maximum swift speed than any other weapon, which is a really cool trait that makes it very unique. Junior got decreased ink consumption, despite being the most ink-efficient weapon in the game, and Aerospray got a larger shot area where it lands, basically meaning it paints better. 52 got some more small buffs that will definitely have more impact later. Zap got two pretty important buffs, with an ink coverage one and allowing MPU to be stacked more easily. Leader would get some interesting buff, increasing its damage to objects such as the Brella Shield, Tennis Shield, Undercover, Bubble Blower, Ink Armor, and Splash Walls. This would mean that against more shield-heavy comps, which was a bit more common with Brella's Intense at the time, Leader would be a bit better at it. Specifically with Splat Brellas, this allowed them to break the shield with only a partial charge. Heavy got some nice speed buffs, so it helped it see a bit more use with its Remix Kit, and Splattershot Pro required one more sub-main power-up to reach 99.9. I hope you guys like that patch note, because it's gonna happen a lot. However, the main change to this patch would be to Bubble Blower, in which special power-up would stack better in smaller quantities, meaning it was a lot easier to run smaller amounts of special power-up for larger bubbles. Outside of that, Inkrez and Haunt got some small buffs. Swiffer got to be a 170p armor, Tri-Nuvo 170p rain, they made Ballpoint not a 230p weapon, thank god, and some small Dapple points for special buffs. On top of that, this patch added the final Sheldon's picks, which notably included the Camo 10, Sploosh 7, Grim Range Blaster, Permanent Ink Brush, Fresh Swiffer, Bamboo Mach 3, Soda Slosher, Remix, and Aerospray PG. So yeah, a lot of good kits added in this one patch. There were some special metas that popped up here, like the Humpback Pump Track, Aerospray Heavy, Booyah Spam. Oh boy, what fun. But for the most part, the things that were strong last patch are still really strong now. The main frontrunner being Mini Spotling. Since its buffs and the buffs to missiles, it was really good at outputting a large quantity of them while still being aggressive. Double Mini was still common at this time. Outside of that, it's worth mentioning that Ink Brush is really good at this time, Tenebrel is really good at this time, and Ballpoint still saw some use, of course. Patch 4.7 would drop on April 23rd, 2019, just a short time after the previous one. More small shooter buffs, in this case main power-up also lessening shot variance when not jumping. Brella got a substantial nerf, where shots would take 15% more ink each. On top of that, this patch had a weird change, where Suction Bomb was increased from 180 to 220. I guess this was made to deal with Brellas, which, fair, but against everything else it was kind of ridiculous, so I don't know why they didn't just increase its damage to Brellas specifically. Or at least go with 200 instead of 220. Splashdown got made a better counter to Baller and Booyah Bomb, nice. Object Shredder got made more effective against Booyah Bomb, another change made to kind of deal with K-Pro. And then last ditch effort. They made the change that allowed it to start applying at 50 or below. This is probably the most unnecessary buff of all time, and while I can understand wanting to make LDE better, this didn't come with any compensation nerfs. If they wanted to do something like this, I think they should at least reduce the amount of effects it gives, because right now it's 8 subs of Ink Saber Sub, Recovery, and Main Saber, which is ridiculous, but was balanced out by the fact that it only applied at 30 or lower. But now it starts applying at 50 or lower, and that's basically why LDE went from a solid ability to a broken one. So, some shooter buffs, an LDE buff, we just need one more thing to put NZAP in its dominating spot, 10 less points for special. And there it is, NZAP 85, the staple support from this patch onward. Outside of that, the Booyah Aerospray and Booyah Remix both got an additional 10 points for special, trying to fix that Humpback Pump Track meta. Mini Spotling got to 210 to reduce the missile output, and Cunder got to 190 to reduce some armor output. This patch was just unnecessary, I'ma be honest. The extra shooter buffs that we've done over and over, the Zap points for special, last ditch effort as a whole, Suction 220 damage, there was just a lot of random changes. There were definitely some good ones, like Brella's change was fine, I guess, and I like that Splashdown does more damage to some objects, and Mini being 210 is necessary, but that's about it. I think this was the first patch where there was more unnecessary than necessary changes, and it really rubs me the wrong way, to be honest. The main changes from this patch were Cunder and Mini fell off a little bit because of the points for special, and NZAP saw a lot more use. And in combination with Tent getting more popular anyway, despite the nerfs, we would see a good bit more Ink Brush, and this was also the time where double Ink Brush was being ran for a while. Keep in mind at this point that Ink Brush had a 160p baller. Ink Brush did introduce some pretty interesting comps, and it was fun to see what teams could do with it, though eventually this would get toned back as well. Which in this case is probably for the best. 160 baller on a meta weapon, yeah, that's a little bit annoying. Patch 4.8 released about a month later on May 28th, 2019, and already we're off to a horrible start because we're buffing Jet Squelcher's paint. I don't know why, but they felt it was necessary despite Custom Jet being in the meta for multiple patches now. Outside of that, Dapples and normal dualies got some decreased ink consumption, which was pretty nice. But Nintendo finally decided mini meta lasted long enough and increased the ink consumption by roughly 15%. This coupled with the 210 points for special would move Mini from a top tier to lower top tier, upper high tier, still a really good weapon, but it would no longer be the staple of the meta anymore. Heavy got its damage decreased slightly because why not? Remix saw a bit of use on Humpback Pump Track and Tower Control, so we got a nerf Heavy finally, woo! They made ballpoint ink slightly less at long range. Welcome to the one of many attempts to get rid of ballpoint. There will be more of them, I promise. And Tenebrella got slightly decreased damage. They also buffed Wall slightly. Again, I don't know why Firefin very good for a while, but sure. Inkjet did more damage to Brellas, and Booyah Bomb has slightly less HP. Outside of that, Charger was made to 220p, and at this point it would start to be more or less entirely replaced by custom Jet Squelcher for Stingray use. Tenebrella and Camo Tenebrella would also become 200p, also nice English patch notes with the Tenebrella 5, you're so funny. And Nintendo wanted to make sure that Kensa Undercover Brella just never saw use again because they increased it by another 10 points for special despite already falling off the meta. So some minor changes from this patch. Brella would fall off a little bit more and we'd see a bit more Tent, we'd see a bit more Custom Jet over Charger, we'd see less Mini, we'd see a tiny bit less ballpoint. Not much changed here, but I guess if I had to single out one thing, it would be Booyah Bomb. That slight amount of decreased HP made it a lot easier to shred, so that did kind of turn into the downfall of weapons like Heavy Remix or Kensa Splattershot Pro. Also, remember the Jet Squelcher buff I said was unnecessary? Yeah, like a week after the patch dropped, World Championships happened, and the JP team won with double Jet Squelcher on some maps and always running one custom jet. Next up was version 4.9, dropping on 26th of June 2019, and the English patch notes don't even have these listed on the normal site, so we're on Inkopedia. Woo! More shooter buffs. In this case, all of the spray shooters and Splash get an extra 57% damage to the Tenebrella shield. Sure. 52 paints better by its feet, which is fair. 96 has less RNG, thank God. Luna Blaster does more damage to 10 and Rainmaker, sure. Clash and Rapids do more damage to Rainmaker. And the Carbon, Roller, and Dapple got increased damage to the Tenebrella shield. I'm starting to see a pattern here. Outside of the Tenebrella changes, this is when Nintendo had enough of X-Splosher being really cheesy in Splat Zone's meta. So they basically made it so if you slosh from high up and far away that it will paint 9% less, with the amount varying depending on exactly how high up and far away you slosh. Basically, sloshing from high up paints less, which is what Explo was really good at, so it's easier to outpaint Explo. The main nerf of this patch, though, is Ballpoint, in which they doubled the amount of shot deviation it had in the air. Before, Ballpoint only had a shot deviation of 2, which is actually really good, and it meant it didn't have much jump spread, and now it's 4, which is a bit significant. I'll go on record, though, and say that this is still a fair change. Ballpoint being able to jump in long range mode and still shred you was a little bit ridiculous. Curling and Autobomb got better damage. Again, this was mostly for dealing with Brellas and especially Tent. Stingray would get its final major nerf here. If it passed through at least one stage object, it would do 17% less damage. On top of that, the damage dealt to Ink Armor would be reduced, even with Object Shredder, therefore making it way easier for armor to protect against Stingray. Stingray would still be really strong after this patch, but this took it away from being the top tier mega oppressive special that you just couldn't deal with to, hey, maybe you can survive it sometimes, especially with armor. Baller would deal less than 180 damage to anything above it in a certain height. This would basically be so it can't kill splashdowns or in some situations damage Booyah Bomb. Outside of that, despite falling off, they decided you, Kensa Pro, 210p. Explo, again, despite dropping off because of the paint nerf, you, 220p. And L3 Nozzle Nose, which I haven't talked about, so why are they adjusting that weapon? Now, Vanilla L3 had ridiculous baller output, which made it a solid option in the normal meta, but it wasn't really a staple pick. The reason they had to nerf it is Turf War. Yeah, so Turf War is more of a major thing in Japan with Nintendo's own Koshien tournaments, and I kid you not, Quad L3 with Baller was the meta. Basically, Turf War meta is, can you move around well, can you paint well, and do you have a special that keeps you alive? and L3 did all of those with a 170 baller. This is the only weapon that really had to get nerfed because of Turf War exclusively, and I'll just spoiler alert future patches, it goes all the way up to 220 later on, and it's still a really good Turf War weapon. Also, at one point there was a quad Sploosh 7 team that went against the quad L3 team. They didn't win, but it was 2-1 in grand finals of one of the Koshin qualifiers, and it's probably one of the most funny matches that have ever existed. Check out the link in the description, it's too good. So yeah, this is the only case where Turf War was a major case as to why something got nerfed, and if you see more L3 points for special later, this is why. Outside of that, this patch was mainly made to nerf Tenebrella, and yeah, Tent would see significantly less usage from this point on. It would still be a good weapon, but it would go away from being the absolute top tier dominating pick that it was before. Also gonna give this patch a small bump of approval for nerfing Ray, because God's sakes that damage was ridiculous, and it's unbelievable it took this long for it to get fixed, but they finally did it here. Outside of that, there was a bit less of ballpoint and a bit more of splash. Again, not much changes in these patches anymore. I'm very torn on the 4.0s. They added a lot of content with main power-up and the different weapon kits, so I can understand it was a lot to manage, and these patches didn't necessarily do a bad job. The game entered a pretty balanced state after the 4.0s, but at the same time, it came with a lot of bad buffs, and a lot of things got hit way too hard or got buffed too much that would feel annoying later into the game's lifespan, such as shooters being way too good, Brellas being over nerfed, etc. A more diverse meta is what the Splatoon devs wanted, and they do get that here. With the 5.0s on the horizon, it'll be interesting to look back on the changes the devs made to get the game in its final spot. Will things get more obnoxious? Spoiler alert, yes. But there also are some more interesting changes up ahead. Hello everyone, it has been a long journey going over all the metas of Splatoon 2, but we're here with the finale, the 5.0s of Splatoon 2. Did the devs end the game in a great spot? We're gonna find out, so be sure to subscribe if you want to see more from me, and without further ado, let's wrap up Splatoon 2. So like with patch 4.9, this one is also not on Nintendo's English patch notes website, but anyway, this dropped on the 31st of July 2019, and was also the last major content update giving us Splatfest and PBs, but that's not important. So first up on the patch notes, as per usual at this point, is shooter buffs for the Sploosh, Junior, Aerospray, Splash, Splattershot, 52, and N-Zap. They are all going to be given an extra 17% extra damage against Booyah Bomb. Kensa Splattershot Pro was starting to fall off, but this basically kind of sealed it. From here on out, it would kind of be a more unoptimal pick and not really have any super good niche. It wouldn't be a bad weapon, but yeah, it wouldn't really be in a great spot anymore. In addition to that, it also required one more sub of main power-up to reach 99.9, because why not? Luna got a slightly larger blast radius, which was pretty decently impactful even if it didn't really push Luna into the meta. Flings a Roller would get 12% increased ink from a vertical flick, which is pretty significant since nowadays Flow Flings is really good at missile output, second only to Vanilla Jet at its range. Tri had weird dead zones in its hitbox where it looked like it would hit and it didn't, and it took until 5.0 for them to fix it, but they did it here. Not would get decreased shot variance, which sounds important, but it's already so little that you can barely tell, and both Dapples and Glugas would use slightly less ink in standard fire. None of those being super important, but you know, nice buffs. Some nice buffs for the aggressive specials in the game. Inkjet shots traveling slightly faster, and Hammer swinging a bit faster. The normal Splat Dualies got to go down to 180, but outside of that, no notable points for special changes. So outside of a bit of extra nerfs to Kensa Splattershot Pro, I think this was a really good patch. Like, the only thing I think they should have added is reducing the points for special for K-Pro to 200 or maybe 190, and I think it honestly would have been perfect. All good changes in this patch increase some good diversity, which is what we always like. There's a bit more shooters, Nautilus would start to see use because of some one-tricks like Bagel, and then there would be more people picking it up later into the game's lifespan. So spoiler alert, Not becomes a pretty good weapon. I mean, it kinda already was, but people didn't use it as much, but yeah, now people are using Not more, I guess. There were 4 weapons that gained a bit of popularity this patch. The L3D would easily be the main one, being great for inkjet output, requiring a low amount of main power, but being pretty good at everything, and since this patch buffed inkjet a little bit, it would definitely start to see some increased usage. This patch is also where we saw more Splat Splattershot Jr., probably about as much as NZAP at the time, though I'd still argue NZAP was the slightly better support. This would be where we started to see both being interchanged a bit more, rather than Zap, Kunder, H3 from the previous few patches. However, with more shooters and a bit more short range in general, as well as people starting to optimize the MPU damage up weapons and looking for an answer to L3, led to Bamboo rising in a lot of popularity and taking its place as the prime new MPU weapon. Oh, and on top of that, Firefin saw a bit more use in zones because it still painted pretty solid and wasn't as high a points for special as the normal charger, so it was pretty good at getting bomb rush. And it was a nice answer to Bamboo or Inkjet. Patch 5.1 dropped on January 6, 2020. Yep, a whole almost 6 months later. Patches are really slowing down at this point. So what did they want to change? Another shooter buff. Oh joy, Splattershot can use its bomb and paint more. I'm sure that won't be more annoying later, and it's totally unnecessary to change. Anyway, Luna Blaster buffs. Let's go. 4 frames less end lag and decreased ink consumption so it can use its bomb more. Some people thought this might put Luna in a niche spot in the meta. It didn't, but it's still nice that they tried and gave Luna some pretty substantial buffs in the end, and I think it makes the weapon feel a lot more playable than it was. You know, it's a lot more than they did for Range Blaster. L3 would easily get the main nerf for this patch, both increasing its ink consumption by 15% and requiring more main power up to deal 99.9, though still a relatively low amount. Both the chargers that were being used at the time would also get nerfed, with Splat Charger having slightly reduced ink coverage, which is pretty substantial considering it already struggled to get a decent amount of specials with both the high points for special and already pretty weak paint. Bamboo would require 1 extra sub a main power up. I told you we're gonna see this patch note a lot. Move along. Splashdown now also seemed to have like an infinite hitbox above it that would one-shot. This had some situational use and was also kind of jank, but yeah, cool, I guess. And it broke Baller easier. Speaking of Baller, yeah, that was still really good in Turf War and still kind of an annoying special to play against, so they also decreased its duration by a second, which I'd say is fair. 10 attack Splattershot got 10 less points for special. This didn't really matter, but Japan really likes this weapon because it literally trended for getting a 10 points for special buff and 8% more ink efficiency. I'm not joking. Some minor buffs to Hero Brush and End Parry Doolies for their inkjet output, but then nerfs to the L3 for Turf War, L3D for the main game, Bamboo for its missile output, Soda because it was pretty good and getting more uses, and Tenna Camo Umbrella because I guess 10's still being used a bit, why not? The meta after this is extremely similar to the 5.0 with a little bit less charger, a little bit less Bamboo, a little bit more ballpoint, a little bit more tent, and a bit less L3D. That's really about it. Mostly just some backline swapping around because of a bit of charger nerfs and a bit more tent because there's a bit less inkjet and baller. That's really it, honestly. So next patch would change that, however. On April 15, 2020, 4 months later, patch 5.2 would drop and have some pretty interesting changes. Flings a Roller's vertical flick would be 3 frames faster, so it would paint even more and be a bit better at defending itself. Tri-Slusher actually got a fire rate buff of 2 extra frames, which means it basically fires 2 frames faster, which means it paints better, it kills faster, it moves faster. Very big buff. Heavy got 6% less ground RNG, nice. Doolies painted a little bit better, nice. Luga Doolies had decreased ink consumption by 7%, nice. Squiffer had a 1 frame faster charge time, nice. So now a very weird change. The unscoped Splat Charger had the reduced time from releasing a charge to being ready to shoot again, so I guess like a full charge release and then either tap shotting or charging, I still can't really tell. And at the same time, they slightly narrowed the width of a full charge shot of scope chargers, which remains unchanged in Splat Chargers, so basically unscopes and scopes now paint the same despite scopes having slightly more range, and there's another small buff for unscopes. Very weird. They did this with the E-liters as well. Ballpoint finally got its big nerf. They slightly reduced its shot velocity, and they reduced the range of long-range mode. It used to around match Hydra, now it's slightly less, and they reduced the movement speed when charging and firing the weapon in close range mode by 10%. So basically they made it a substantial bit worse in both modes. Ballpoint would still see some use, but this is basically the point where it fell from being a top tier Splatling to a high tier, maybe you can argue top tier 1, and its usage rate would fall off significantly. On top of that, with the increase in tents, Nintendo also wanted to deal with Tenebrella, in which they made it take 40 extra frames longer before you could regen the shield. So basically before, you could get up another shield pretty much instantly after the one was launched, and now there's a slight bit of a delay, which honestly is kind of fair because you could shield yourself so fast it was kind of ridiculous, and I'm okay with this. Not sure if it needed the ink consumption nerf as well, but alright. They made Mist Effect Baller, and then they made ballers have weight classes, so if you play a lightweight weapon, your baller is faster, mostly in turning, and if you play a heavyweight weapon, then you're slower when turning and moving, and that only applied to Explo, so this patch secretly nerfed X-Splosher randomly, and they didn't change its price for special down from 220. I don't know why Nintendo doesn't like this weapon anymore, please. And, you know, on top of that, they also increased the time before it to explode by 16 frames. So basically, when you hold down the ZR button and you start an explosion, that takes an additional 16 frames, in which the baller can be broken and it's easier to move out of the way. So if you've heard me talk about baller's special design and how it was really bad because it would be a panic button that could kill people, yeah, this was Nintendo's answer. Make it a panic button that very rarely, if ever, kills people. After that, they changed Bubble Blower, and I like this one. They made it so bubbles last an extra 2 seconds on the map, but they reduced the size of the first and second bubbles. Basically, this is a slight nerf to the bubble combo, but having bubbles last a long time got buffed. So, you know, how the special was intended to be used is better, and the cheap BS combo got worse. Points for special just saw Squeezer getting a bit more, L3 getting a bit more, CRB 10 less, that doesn't matter, and Ink Brush getting 20 more, finally. There's a lot of mixed opinions on this patch because of the outcome. There was definitely a bit lower weapon diversity. Nothing crazy, but it was more strict, and mainly we saw the rise of 4 weapons at the top, being the Sorella, NZAP 85, Bamboo Mach 1, and Custom Dually Squelcher. There were definitely still a lot of other weapons. This is probably when Kensa Rapid was the best, because despite the baller nerfs, everything else at the top tier was great for it. There was stuff like Squeezer, Chargers, Custom Jet, you know, a bunch more other weapons I could list. However, this is the final time in the meta where a dominant set of 4 weapons would be at the top, and you would fight a lot of that comp of the Zap, Sorella, Squelcher, Bamboo, or variants that would include double Brella or double Squelcher. However, the reason I say this is mixed is because a lot of people kind of like that. They were strong main weapons, even if MPU damage up was something to deal with, and special output was mostly lower. Now, yes, of course, Brella still was only 180, Squelcher wasn't 220 yet, so it wasn't perfect, but it was a lot less special output than we were used to with the previous updates, which I think honestly felt better. I think a lot of people will be split on either the 5.0 or 1, where things were more diverse, but a bit more special spammy, versus this patch where things were a bit less diverse, but less special spammy, on which is better. In my opinion, it's the 5.2s, but it could definitely be argued that it's either of them. To wrap up the patches in 2020, it was version 5.3.0 released on August 18th. Splattershot in 52 would get some small buffs, basically making it so that the RNG spread takes a bit longer. Basically how all shooters work is when you start shooting, they're very accurate, and they gradually get less accurate. And this means the time before the accuracy is reset is smaller. However, this is a pretty short patch, and it's mainly here to nerf the main 4 weapons I mentioned previously, though a little bit light on the Zap. Bamboo would get 20% increased ink consumption, which means it only had 11 instead of 14 shots on a full tank, making its output way lower. Dually Squelchers would get hit even harder. Rolls would use 8% instead of 5 of the ink tank, and the shots were a tiny bit harder to hit people with, meaning you had to be a little bit more accurate. However, Brella was the big nerf for this patch. 18 damage of each pellet was reduced to 16.2. This also means the maximum damage that could be dealt was dropped from 90 to 81. Basically, a lot of the damage breakpoints were changed in this update for Brella, making it require 1 extra pellet to kill. And at long range, even with really good aim, it made 2 shots really unreliable, and more often than not would require 3 shots to kill, which is incredibly slow and means if you're fighting at around a shooter range, you have much less pressure, and Brella needs to get closer, even if it has amazing aim. The sight's also missing it, but in addition to that, Brella went from 180 to 200, which was more than fair. It had a really high special output. This patch was a weird one because I felt like the meta never really developed that much from it. We saw more Neo Splash, we saw less of the 5.2 top tiers and more of the weapons in 5.0 and 1, minus Ballpoint, of course, and I mean, it was fine, but it's hard to comment on because I feel like the next patch hit and changed things pretty much immediately. Version 5.4 would be released on February 25th, 2021, and yeah, there's a Splattershot feed paint buff, nobody cares. 52, increased radius of ink that lands when you shoot far away by 27%. Originally, people didn't think a lot of this when they were translating it from Japanese because they thought it was general paint buff, which while it's a lot, would not be too much. However, this is not just a paint buff, this is a painting range buff. Not only do you paint better, but you paint further away and therefore more safely, So this catapulted 52 ahead with its Kensa kit, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Dapples and normal dualies had less ink consumption when firing. H3 actually got a huge ink consumption increase, I guess because it's an MPU weapon, but it never saw more popularity than Zap, so I don't know. I guess the devs just don't like it. Dualie Squelcher got an extra 25% jump spread immediately after jumping, which also made the roll tech harder, as there was a tighter window to pull it off without getting RNG. And while it's not on the English page, Squeezer also got an increased ink consumption in its painting mode by 20%, which, while not exactly ink hungry, is quite a lot. Torpedo took an extra 8 frames before you could recover ink after throwing Torpedo, and in the points for special changes, there were some small nice ones to K Jr. and Kunder. Firefin got an extra 10, E-Liter got an extra 10, and Dualie Squelchers got an extra 10 points for special. So this kicked off the quad shooter meta. K52 was totally a weapon that was dealt with best by shooters and completely countered non-shooters. It was really hard to break wall with all the ink efficiency nerfs. You were dependent on a bomb, which was also harder with all the ink efficiency nerfs, and K-Gal could paint super safely, super far, and get a reliable special output. Also, at this point, all of the strong weapons that countered shooters, with the exception of Nautilus, which got dealt with by special spam, were pretty much nerfed. Brella being the main culprit that would keep shooters back quite a bit, and now it was a lot easier to either avoid it or deal with it using specials. I've talked a lot about quad shooter meta and how we got here in this video, so I'm not going to mention it a ton here, so if you want to learn more about it, check it out. But let's just go into 5.5 and what it adjusted. Version 5.5 released on September 24th, 2021, and is likely the final balance patch Splatoon 2 will ever get. There was a small buff to Splattershot that increased its damage, meaning a bomb defense would not stop a bomb plus 2 shots killing, and it also made the fall-off damage a little bit better. Roller, Octobrush, and Dualies all got better ink consumption, and 52's paint from far away was reduced by 5%, making the previous buff of 27 the equivalent of 22%. Still a lot, but it is slightly easier to deal with. There's a lot of points for special changes, and the buffs aren't really as notable, though they are nice, but with the nerfs, K-Gal got an extra 10 points for special, reducing its Booyah output, C-Jet finally got nerfed a little bit in Ray output, Squeezer with Bubbles, and E-Liter with Rain. And that brings us today. Quad shooter is the meta, but many other comps and weapons can still work, and the game is what the devs wanted it to be at the start. Very coordination-based and team-reliant. I'll be honest, this wasn't the perfect direction from the game. I think we all know that by now, and there are a lot of things that needed adjustments, and we're seeing it with Splatoon 3. And I still hope we get a 5.6 and they do a little bit more. Reducing missile output a tiny bit, maybe having armor be a lighter duration, something similar to what they did with invincibilities at the end of Splatoon 1 would just go a long way. I don't hate the current meta where it is, honestly, even as someone who doesn't play any shooters. I think just some small adjustments would go a long way to making people appreciate the things it does well, so I kinda hope we get that even though I'm not expecting it. Could the same goal have been achieved better? Absolutely. But it was certainly hard. Splatoon 1 wasn't exactly left in a perfectly balanced state, and the devs had to do a lot of work in Splatoon 2, which is something we might take for granted nowadays. This game used to be very unbalanced. I think the devs have learned a lot from this game, and Splatoon 3 will be a better direction with better balance. But regardless, appreciate the Splatoon 2 meta for the things it does well, because it is honestly still pretty cool and far from bad. But with that being said, we've covered everything about the meta history of Splatoon 2. I have one more episode before Splatoon 3's, which is the finale for Splatoon 1, the damage defense meta, and the quick respawn meta at the end of the game. In today's meta history, we have a bit of a special episode. We're going to be talking about the very first meta, when the game just launched. And a lot of people don't know just how broken Splatoon 1 was when it launched. This game was effectively in beta phase. Let me give you an example. You know how rollers have to be accurate in order to one-shot you? You know, pretty standard thing. Obviously, the entire flick hitbox can't be a kill zone, right? Well, in early Splatoon 1, it was. It didn't matter where you hit them. If the flick connected, they would die in one shot. And not only that, because this gets better, you can also kill them if you don't have ink, including when you roll, and the flick does 180 damage. Because why not? This is what early Splatoon 1 was like. So if you enjoy this video and want to see more episodes of the meta history from me, be sure to subscribe, and without further ado, let's cover the rest of the broken stuff in this game. Splatoon 1 didn't just have crazy early weapons, it also had crazy specials. Everyone knows Kraken and Bubbler, the invincibility specials that broke the game, but they used to be so much worse. The main counterplay to Bubbler and Kraken is that you could knock them back. But at the start of the game, they had barely any knockback whatsoever, and Kraken's hitbox was a little bit smaller, so good luck taming them back then. And the devs must have really liked Kraken, because it had more than that. There was also basically no end lag, so once your Kraken ran out, you could immediately attack out of it, something that was really common for the Krakon rollers. And it's a big part of why Krakon was one of the most hated weapons at the start of the game. Another weapon that was even crazier at launch than you remember is the E-liter. Now, chargers had this thing in Splatoon 1 where they could kill with partial charges, but at the start of the game, that was a ridiculous amount. By stacking around 3 mains worth of damage up, E-liter could one-shot with 55% of a charge. It was essentially a Squiffer that could also just double its range whenever it wanted. Oh, and that's not all. Old E-liter had burst bombs, and burst bombs at the start of Splatoon 1, while being a little bit weaker than they are today, allowed you to throw not 3, but 4 of them. They used 25% of your ink tank, and on top of that, E-liter had a special called Echolocator that would instantly refill your ink tank in addition to locating everyone on the other team. Which means that if you ran up to an E-liter who had special, they could throw 4 burst bombs at you, pop Echo, and throw another 4 burst bombs at you without any extra gear. Add on top of it that you can run 5 burst bombs with Sub-Saber and had damage up so those burst bombs were dealing extra damage, and that's the hell that people had to deal with fighting this thing. Speaking of long-range things that were broken in close range, Ink Zuka. Now, Zuka currently takes almost a full second before you get your first shot out, but at the start of the game, that was about half a second, which while it might not seem like a lot, keep in mind everyone was brand new at this game, so it essentially made Zuka a panic button and something to take out the longest range weapon in the game. Splatoon 1 obviously had its fair share of broken abilities, but the only one that was a thing really early in the game was Ink Res, something that would get patched out really fast because a main of Ink Res, because it was a main exclusive ability, basically gave you ink immunity. It would take a long time for you to be damaged and you would be incredibly fast in enemy ink. Another broken sub is Splash Wall. Not only did Wall take 40% more damage, and you could recover your ink about twice as fast after throwing it, but there was a broken technique called showering. Basically, by standing in the middle of the ink tank, you would be protected from literally all sides, so you couldn't just bomb someone behind their wall. It was really crazy, basically giving you extra health if you stayed in the middle. But forget everything else I've mentioned, the most stupid thing at launch was blasters. Now, currently, blasters indirects cap at 70 damage. They can't do any more than that, but I'll just let you take a guess. What is the maximum damage an indirect can do at the start of Splatoon 1? If you guessed 99 damage, you're wrong, because the answer is 125! To put that number into perspective, not only is that going to make indirects one-shot, but that's also the damage directs deal in Splatoon 2. And guess what? It gets worse. Some of you might have realized that if the maximum damage is above 100, then stacking damage up will not cap at 99.9. So not only could you kill with indirects, but if you stack damage up, your indirect one-shot radius would get larger. And you know, Luna in the first game already has Clash Blaster's hitbox, same for Normal Blaster, just as a reference to how bad that is. So, all of those were clearly crazy, especially considering that the game was brand new, so nobody really knew what they were doing, but also the lack of content at launch. There were only old maps, which sucked and were really cramped, so lockouts were super hell to deal with, especially with everyone being new, like I said. But there was only zones. There was no Tower and Rainmaker. Those are DLC modes in Splatoon 1. Even private battles didn't exist until a future update. So the start of the game, people primarily played Turf War in competitive, meaning the meta were painting weapons like shooters, rollers, which people considered painting weapons at the time, and, as you guessed, blasters for smaller maps. What about E-liter? That would actually take a few months, because people thought chargers were really bad in Turf War at the start of the game. A stigma that still exists today, oddly enough. Oh, and one more weapon that people really hated, even though it really had nothing special about it at the time, Aerospray. It was unlockable in single player, and you know, everyone being new, painting weapons in Turf War only, meant that Aerospray got really obsessed over, and r/Splatoon and Squidboards, which is where most of the community lived because Discord didn't really exist yet, had so much complaints about Aerospray. Even though the weapon's not really that different nowadays, it was hated back then. Pretty much everything I listed here got fixed in patch 2.2.0, which is basically where the game actually became balanced and we started to have stuff like Rainmaker and tower control being added to the game. We also got SNS+, which I guess this isn't relevant to the meta, but it's worth noting that ranks capped at A+, and you could gain and lose ranked points in squad, aka league battles. Burst bombs didn't get patched until 2.7.0, which is the best patch Splatoon has ever had, either game, by a landslide. I'll go over that someday, I promise. During these few months, a lot of techniques were discovered. There was sub-strafing back and forth for movement, burst canceling on burst bomb weapons, and other similar techniques, like stealth swimming, so you didn't need to rely on Ninja Squid to be able to move without being seen. So it was really cool to see the community develop what would become staples, even to this day. But before 2.2 dropped, the meta did eventually settle around one weapon, the 96 Gal Deco. As for comps with 96 Deco, there weren't too much thought put into it, again, everyone being very new at the time. Another 96 Deco or normal 52 would be useful for double wall. We would see Crack-On or Dynamo Roller for slaying/painting power and the ability to hit around corners, as well as a little bit of Luna for that, for the main representative of blasters. We saw plenty of 10-attack splatter shot, a little bit of E-liter if you had a charger team, but probably the main comp at the time was 96 Deco, 52, Dynamo, and the 10-attack splatter shot. So that's what's ran with 96, but what makes this 96 Gal Deco such a pain? Why do people hate it so much? Well, it might be hard to get it, but basically, it's a 2-shot Gal weapon, so messing up a little bit gets you killed instantly, and the weapon also has a lot of painting range, so it can exist and paint really far away from itself, meaning it would get a lot of value just by existing. And on top of that, it had a wall. So even though this weapon happened to have accuracy problems, only being needed to get hit by 2 shots, the painting range, and the wall to keep itself alive, meant that taking it down was an absolute pain. And even if you got past that, the weapon just had a panic button that it could pop, not die in that whatsoever, and then it would throw another wall. I'm just very grateful that this is in the past and this weapon's balanced nowadays, because I can't imagine dealing with a Gal that paints for itself, wall, panic button to the time is a flat circle. But that's the early history of Splatoon 1. I hope you enjoyed learning about the absolute craziness that this game had to offer, and be sure to subscribe if you want to see more episodes of the meta history. In the last episode of the Splatoon 1 meta history, I covered the absolutely chaotic Stone Age when no one knew what they were doing. But after that era, 2 distinct metas would rise. The first would be a damage defense meta, one mostly happening in the western scene, and the last one would be the infamous quick respawn invincibilities meta. Why were these popular? What comps were ran with them? And what changes led to this game being what we know it as today? I'm going to be covering all of that in this video, so if you enjoy, please consider subscribing. Without any further delay, let's get right into the video. So after version 2.2 dropped on October 20th, 2015, the damage and defense meta would slowly start to creep into the western scene and a little bit in Japan, though it took a lot of time to develop, as again, game's still very new at the time. The meta would last until around October-ish 2016, but it's a bit hard to say because in Japan, they transitioned to quick respawn stealth jump much sooner, closer to around the release date of 2.7.0, which launched on April 12, 2016. And what triggered the transition from damage defense to quick respawn in the western scene was actually the top western team, Chimera, losing to a top JP team running 2 Zinc minis and a lot of quick respawn. So yeah, a very weird and long era where development in the western scene was kinda hard. A lot of the mentality at the time was very anti-meta, and there was way more whining about it than there was today, and this would only continue into the quick respawn meta. It's worth noting about that weird cultural difference. There were genuine debates on if using the meta was okay and if you were a bad person for exploiting it. That's how bad things were at the time. But anyway, why do people care about damage defense in the first place? Damage up was used for about 5 reasons. 1, it increased some weapons' time to kill / hitbox size. These would be things like chargers being able to kill in less of a partial charge, or rollers having a wider one-hit kill box. The second would be weapons decreasing the shots to kill if the opponents were basically touching enemy ink for a tiny millisecond. Pretty much exactly the same as MPU damage up today, except it's on way more weapons, and it stacks way better, and it also affects subs and specials. Yikes. Thirdly, it would be used on weapons that have a low, close to 100 kill time, so for example things like 52 that deals barely 104 damage. It would be used to basically increase its kill range since the fall-off shots would do more damage. Fourth, it would be used on weapons for combo potential, for example 96 doing 72 damage to combo with bombs or other weapons, which also had the benefit of helping the fall-off damage one that I mentioned previously for free. And the final major reason it was used was to counter defense up. And oh boy, now we can talk about why I hate this meta. The only hard counter to damage up was defense up, and the only hard counter to defense up was damage up. Sure, some weapons would run it to do certain damage thresholds like I've mentioned before, but defense up could always counter it, so you might need a little bit more depending on who you're facing. So how do you adjust that? Well, you would have to change your gear and have a lot of sets. In a game with an even worse and more randomized gear system than Splatoon 2. In a game where the main abilities can't even be changed and there's a lot less gear. So in other words, you would have to really grind for optimal gear, really specific quantities, and you would want a ton of them to adjust for the amount of defense and damage your opponents would run in a game where it was literally just a slot machine to get that. Not only was getting gear like this incredibly unreliable, but damage and defense was just not fun. It made consistent kill times kind of go out the window. You would need 75% of a charge to kill this guy, but 80% to kill that one, or you would need 4 shots to kill this T-Tech. It was just a pain to keep track of, especially in a game where you can't see your opponent's abilities on the minimap at all times like you can in Splatoon 2. So yeah, this meta had a multitude of problems, and it was basically a pain. But let's real quick go over the comps that were ran before everything changed to the quick respawn meta we know today. Well, weapons like the 10 attack Splattershot, 52, and 96 would fall off a bit, since defensive was very strong against those weapons. Mainly teams would be built around weapons like the E-Liter, Dynamo, or Luna Blaster, depending on the map. There were some interesting builds, probably the most notable being a full defensive 10 attack from Tim in order to win 1v1s. There would also still be some niche uses, one notable one I can remember being a lot of charge up on Splash. Ultimately, there weren't that many weapons to shift between compared to something in Splatoon 2, and a lot of people ended up sticking with their comfort picks at this time. Now, before we jump into the quick respawn meta, I want to real quick go over the best update Splatoon 1 ever had, and the other 2 balance patch updates. Yep, there were only 3 left after 2.2.0, 2.7, 8, and 9, as everything else didn't adjust balance changes, and was mostly just for bug fixes or stage adjustments. First of all, this patch added special depletion, where every weapon would either have 75%, 60%, or 40% lost upon death. This would basically evolve into points for special on weapons instead of specials in Splatoon 2. They also added weight classes in this, with the heavy weapons of Dynamo, E-Liter, and Hydra. In Splatoon 2, this would involve to include more weapons and also include the light class. So yeah, 2 staple features in Splatoon 2 got their start here in a balance change. There's not much to say for the main weapons, pretty much all of these changes were good. The most notable one would be that chargers got a nice adjustment where basically if you don't have a full charge, you'd have 20% less range, making damage up much less oppressive. And they even compensated by giving small buffs to Splatterscope and E-Liter, making them a bit more similar to each other. Additionally, this patch also fixed Burst Bomb, making it the 2 burst you know today instead of 4, and being much better balanced. And finally, the only other patch note worth going over is they basically nerfed location stuff like Echo, but they also nerfed how good Cold-Blooded was against it, basically making location stuff slightly worse, but Cold-Blooded also slightly worse. It was weird. After that, 2.8.0 would come out, which would do some small adjustments, mainly Zimmy going from 60 to 75% with how popular it was, and there would also be some nice other small balance changes. The only notable one here would be Stealth Jump, which basically made it so you could only attack once you've landed from Stealth Jump. This was done because Dynamo's horizontal flick could do it immediately upon landing, and Stealth Jump in Splatoon 1 made your landing completely invisible. So yes, they had to nerf an entire ability because of Dynamo. Lastly, a bit later was 2.9.0, which was here to adjust Dynamo and invincibilities. Dynamo would get a hitbox nerf by 18%, but a little bit better damage to the Rainmaker shield, but also it would take longer to recover your ink after flicking. Dynamo was pretty good and oppressive, and it would still be really good toward the end, but this would make its hitbox a little bit inconsistent. I think they nerfed it by a bit too much. I also have no idea why this is listed as all the Dynamos separately. This applies to all 3 Dynamos. Weird. The final patch happened was an adjustment to invincibilities, which, spoiler alert, does not affect the QR invincibility meta whatsoever, these would still only become more common. But basically this made the duration a little bit lower unless if you stacked special duration up. Which is great because since everyone was running quick respawn, no one wanted to run special duration up. So this basically made the specials have a little bit less time. I really wish we got something like this for armor and antenna missiles in Splatoon 2. Anyway, the quick respawn meta is fairly self-explanatory. Being able to consistently lower your respawn time is just inherently such a broken ability, even compared to anything else in Splatoon 1. With invincibility specials rising as the ability to keep yourself alive becomes more and more valuable, the idea to be able to come back really fast right after dying to them is also really valuable. And with stealth jump, having just a single teammate to jump to can lead to your entire team coming back in. Winning just one fight or getting a few picks isn't good enough in this meta. You would have to get a ton in order to make something happen because the respawn times and jumping back in would just be so fast, and it led to a very unique style of Splatoon that we don't really have today. As for comps being ran, we saw a lot of Wasabi Splattershot, Cherry H3, Custom Range Blaster, Slosher, Bento Charger, a little bit of E-Liter, and a little bit of Dynamo. There were some other niche weapons, such as Octobrush's ability to crack into locations and set up beacons on something like Moray, but for the most part, the meta was really strict here. Back in late 2017, this was a rather hated and divisive meta, but it seems nowadays people look back on it pretty fondly. Maybe it's just the extreme nature of Splatoon 1 aging really well compared to a more tame version that we have in Splatoon 2, but it's hard to say. Regardless, with the nostalgia glasses off, I think it's important to say that this meta wasn't exactly perfect, and while it was really fun for aggressive weapons and a lot of the meta weapons were very skill-based, it did still have consequences that weren't exactly great. The meta wasn't super diverse, individual skill was a bit too strong compared to team play, and overall it was just kinda harsh. What I will say about it is that quick respawn was a necessary evil. While extreme in itself, it mitigated pretty much every other extreme aspect in Splatoon 1 and made it slightly more tolerable. Imagine dealing with a Kraken with a 10-second respawn time. It just wouldn't really be fun. While Splatoon 1 may be looked back more fondly these days, both Splatoon 1 and 2's metas ended in a sub-optimal spot, but neither one could really be fixed without moving on to the next game. That's part of what makes them so interesting to me. Both of these metas have their strengths and weaknesses, and I think both will be looked back on fondly for one reason or another, but the third game is a chance to correct those problems and have a game that's better designed at its core. But you know what? No game is gonna have a perfect meta, and I think despite its flaws, Splatoon 1 did a pretty good job of ending things in a pretty nice spot, and it shows with how fondly people like to revisit the game nowadays. With that all being said though, we now have a completed meta timeline for all of Splatoon 1 and 2. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this series, and I look forward to bringing you guys it once again once we have more developments in Splatoon 3 and can tell the story of that game. So once again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all in Splatoon 3.